He didn't even know he had a business. He wasn't looking for a way to make money, and he wasn't Googling income ideas. He simply opened a shed that hadn't been opened in decades and saw what others would have called junk. A year later, that nothing brought him a serious amount of money. How much exactly, you'll find out in the story. No startup, no team, no risk. This isn't a story about luck. It's about how money is sometimes already sitting in your own backyard. You just have to stop walking past it. Episode 1, The Shed No One Opened. In Texas, in a small town where there's more land between houses than fences, he lived an ordinary life. He was in his 40s, worked with his hands, didn't dream about business, and didn't listen to podcasts about passive income. His house came from his grandfather, along with the land, an old porch, and a crooked shed at the back of the yard. The shed was the kind of place where you throw everything you don't know what to do with. Rusty shovels, broken furniture, lidless boxes, canisters with dried oil. It had been locked for decades. No one expected anything useful from it. One spring, after another season of dust storms, he decided to clean up the yard. Not because of an idea, not because of money, just because he wanted more space. When he reached the shed, the door opened with effort, as if it didn't want to let him in. The smell was thick and oil, metal, time. He started carrying out junk layer by layer until a massive shape emerged from the darkness. Something huge, heavy, covered in dirt and rust. At first it looked like scrap metal, but as he got closer, he saw the shape, the levers, the massive frame. It was an old blacksmith press, industrial, mechanical, the kind of equipment that used to run for decades before disappearing when production became modular. He didn't remember his grandfather ever talking about a press, but the machine stood there as if it had been waiting. That was the first moment a thought flashed through his mind. Maybe this wasn't just old junk. Episode 2, when old iron came back to life. He spent several days figuring out what to do with it. First, he cleaned off the dust, lubricated the moving parts, checked the mechanics. The press creaked, but it worked. Every pull of the lever responded with a dull thud, as if complaining about decades of silence. He started researching it, not out of business interest, but simply to understand what kind of machine it was. He learned that these presses are used by blacksmiths, metalworkers, artists, small workshops, anyone who can't afford modern industrial machines. There were almost no new equivalents. Old ones were either dismantled or rusting away in sheds, just like this one. He saw it clearly. Demand existed, but supply was almost zero. At first, he thought about selling it. He checked listings and saw prices that didn't cover the weight of the press, the time, or its real value. That's when an idea appeared, one that felt almost too simple. Don't sell it, rent it out. He posted a primitive ad, just a couple of lines, no photo shoot, no website. Blacksmith press for rent, Texas, for workshops and projects. 2 days later, the first person wrote, then a second, then more. It turned out people were willing to drive for hours just to work on that machine. He set the price, a few $100s per week. The amount felt reasonable and triggered even more interest. Some rented it for weekends, some for a month. Some arrived with trailers, others worked right on site. He didn't promote anything. He never shouted about it. He simply opened the shed, turned on the press, and watched old iron return to work. For the first time, he wasn't thinking about what he was selling, but about the fact that he had found a way to give an old thing a second life. And somewhere between the creak of metal and the movement of the lever, the shed stopped being junk and became an asset. When the schedule filled itself, at the beginning, he treated the rentals casually, almost carelessly. A message here, a phone call there. He scribbled dates on scraps of paper and taped them to the inside wall of the shed. There was no system, no plan, just a machine being used from time to time. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tone of the requests changed. People stopped asking, is it available? And started asking, when is the next opening? That subtle shift mattered more than any spike in revenue. It meant demand had crossed into expectation. He bought a simple wall calendar and began marking entire weeks instead of individual days. The press stopped being something that occasionally worked and became something that operated on a rhythm. Blacksmiths from neighboring towns began coming back regularly, sometimes on a fixed schedule. A small fabrication shop booked it every other month for batch production. An independent artist reserved time months in advance for a large metal installation. What surprised him most was consistency. Once someone used the press, they almost always returned. Not because it was the cheapest option, but because it worked and because they knew what to expect. Reliability turned out to be the real product. He adjusted the terms quietly. Weekly rentals became the default instead of daily ones. Longer bookings received priority access. He introduced a modest deposit, not to squeeze more money, but to protect the calendar. The effect was immediate. Cancellations disappeared. Conversations shortened. The quality of clients improved. Then he noticed another friction point: transportation. Moving a machine that heavy wasn't easy, so instead of fighting it, he leaned into it. He offered on-site use. He cleared out more space in the shed, reinforced the floor, installed proper lighting, added safety lines and simple rules. People paid extra to avoid moving the press. Some even treated the shed like a temporary workshop. Without any advertising, without expanding beyond the yard, the place developed a quiet gravity. Word spread naturally. Some weeks the press ran almost every day, the sound of metal echoing through the property. Other weeks it rested, but the calendar stayed full months ahead. The income stopped fluctuating. It became something he could anticipate. He was no longer wondering if someone would rent the press. He was deciding how to allocate time. That mental shift was crucial. For the first time, he could estimate his month before it started, and that predictability changed how he viewed the entire situation. He finally understood that the press wasn't making money simply because it existed. It was making money because it had been placed inside a system that removed uncertainty and rewarded consistency. By this point, he no longer viewed what was happening as a coincidence or a lucky side effect. The blacksmith press found in the old shed had quietly shifted roles. It was no longer just a heavy, immobile machine made of iron and bolts. It had become the center of a growing pattern. At first, rentals were infrequent and informal, a few days here, a weekend there. He charged simple rates, hourly, sometimes daily, adjusting on instinct rather than strategy. But already 3 to 4 months after the first serious clients, the rhythm changed. The calendar stopped having gaps. People began planning around the press rather than fitting it into spare time. What stood out most was repetition. Clients returned, not because there were no alternatives, but because this option removed friction. Some booked the press for 5 to 7 consecutive days, especially when working on larger pieces or production runs. Others returned on a predictable cycle, every 2 or 3 months, treating the shed almost like a remote extension of their own workshops. The press became something they could rely on, and reliability turned out to be more valuable than novelty. The base rental alone started bringing in around $1,800 to $2,200 per month, but that was only the surface. Over time, small questions turned into paid solutions. Could materials be stored on site to avoid transport? Yes, for a modest monthly fee. Could someone lock in a fixed time slot every month to avoid uncertainty? Yes, for priority access pricing. Could the press be used late at night when no one else was around? Yes, at a higher rate. None of these additions were dramatic on their own, but together they quietly added another $800 to $1,200 per month. He never announced these changes. There were no price lists posted online, no packages marketed. Everything emerged organically through conversations. And what surprised him was the lack of resistance. Clients didn't push back. They understood the logic. In fact, many appreciated the clarity. They weren't paying for extras, they were paying to remove obstacles. Importantly, he resisted the temptation to scale outward. He didn't buy a second press, he didn't extend the shed or hire help. Expansion would have added complexity, and risk. Instead, he focused on depth, one machine, one location, fewer clients, but better ones. This decision protected the system. It kept the operation manageable and predictable. By the end of the year, income from secondary services nearly matched income from basic rentals. The press was no longer the only source of value, and it became the anchor around which a small ecosystem formed. Even during slower weeks, income rarely dropped below $2,500 per month, and during peak periods it approached $4,000. When he finally sat down and reviewed several months of numbers, one thing became clear: this wasn't a fragile setup. It didn't depend on trends, algorithms, or constant promotion. It depended on usefulness, on consistency, on showing up with something that solved real problems. And once that clicked, he understood that the press wasn't just being rented, it was being integrated. Exactly 1 year after he first opened the old shed, he opened his notes again and summed everything into a single line. Not for reporting, not for bragging, just to understand the scale. The final figure came to approximately $41,000 over 12 months. No startup, no loans, no investors. Effectively, no starting capital, just an existing asset, time, and careful attention to demand. He realized he didn't earn this money by discovering something rare, but by properly using what others had ignored for decades. The amount didn't make him a millionaire, but it changed his mindset. He began seeing his surroundings differently. Old tools, unused spaces, forgotten skills, all of it stopped being background noise. He understood that value isn't always created through innovation. Sometimes it's simply unlocked. The blacksmith press remained the same. It didn't become newer or faster. Only its role changed. From a dusty object, it turned into a source of steady income. And that became the strongest takeaway of the story. Money doesn't always need to be invented. Sometimes it already exists, waiting for someone to recognize its potential.